Jacksonian era near the mid-1800s, factories were created for mass manufacturing. This caused a shift from agricultural to factory working for many Americans. On a farm, the whole family worked together to grow crops for trade and food. But as the factories appeared, many workers began to take jobs at them. This caused a large influx of wage slavery. The conditions when working in a factory during the Industrial Revolution were terrible. The working hours were brutal, usually lasting over 14 hours a day and 6 days a week. This was done for very little pay, just enough to survive, hence the term wage slaves. Child labor was common, with children beginning to work for 8 hours a day between the ages of 9 to 13. The factories were also very dangerous for these wage slaves. The employer would never need to compromise a worker if they were injured in an accident. The loss of limbs and fingers were everyday occurrences. They had a complete lack of worker rights during this time. In the 1820s and 1830s, labor unions began to form, wanting higher pay and 10-hour workdays, but they lacked the resources to fund strikes and other protests. Some victories were had later, with the workday being shortened to 10 hours and union strikes being legalized in the 1840s. So at this time of the Jacksonian era, the mid-1800s, women and other factory workers were still second-class citizens. They were only above the slaves. Despite this, the idea of true womanhood began to come up. Catherine Beecher wrote a treatise on domestic economy, which argued that women could find fulfillment within their homework. And this homework was to raise the family. They were seen as morally superior to the men. They had the job of raising good Christian kids, which was somewhat empowering, at least for the time. A number of activists began to come up as well. Margaret Fuller argued for the political rights of women, that they should be able to vote, which was seen as very radical at the time. Susan B. Anthony was a heavy proponent of women's suffrage, writing numerous essays, and anti-slavery ideas also began to come up through people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as they sympathized with the African Americans to a degree. But overall, women were still sort of a fringe movement here, because if they portrayed themselves as anything other than weak and vulnerable, they would be ostracized. All ideas of chivalry and kindness would be thrown out the window, so they certainly weren't treated well at the time.
A number of movements were generated by these ideas of equality. Prohibition was one example of moral superiority over men. Women's suffrage and anti-slavery were linked usually. Educational reforms were the fact that women could start receiving legitimate education. Prison reforms, one example was Dorothea Dix saw the terrible conditions in prisons. Seneca Falls Convention was when they argued the right to vote unofficially, beginning the struggle for women's rights. Voting rights were eventually achieved in 1920. Did I say Seneca Falls?
Go.
We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down and every path laid open to women as freely as men.